The different attitudes towards literary translation were not only connected with the problems of intercultural exchange, but also with the tensions in Egyptian society in the late 1980s. Radical Islamists had staged a fierce campaign against the supposed immorality proliferated through the arts. Theater, singing, and dancing were condemned, since they provoked frivolity, licentiousness, and promiscuity. Accusations were also directed against literature, and a large number of Arab authors were reproached for a secularist world view hostile to religion in general and to Islam in particular. There was a feeling among Islamist movements that these reprehensible activities derived from the Western influences and increasing servility to Western materialistic culture. These influences, it was held, was threatening the true Islamic identity of Egypt and the Arab world. Discussions of this kind obviously affected the position of writers who were not only attacked in the ongoing polemics but also participated in the debates on the cultural orientation of the country and relations with Europe. As far as the translation of literature was concerned, some would stress the danger that European translation programs would only be an extension of efforts at consolidating European supremacy, of imperialist schemes to dominate Egyptian culture and to endorse Orientalist representations of the Arabs. European translators, it was said, were inclined to select titles that would appeal to public bias and to forget about a faithful representation of the Egyptian and, by extension, Arab soul. This attitude was strengthened by the idea of some authors that in literature Europe had ceased to provide the models. The European novel had exhausted its potential and had lost its relevance for the dilemmas facing the Arab world. Authors preferred to direct their glance at literature in Latin America and Asia, which reflected problems and issues similar to those in Arab societies, and which no longer considered Europe as setting the standards for literature. In contrast, other writers emphasized the importance of strong cultural ties with Europe and of literary translations. Many authors offered their work for translation, perhaps out of personal motives, while others saw the interest of European intellectuals in Arab culture as an important force counterbalancing the growing interference of Islamist movements in Egyptian culture. Embedding Arabic literature in international intellectual networks would protect authors from the enemy within, the Islamists who propagated the moral purgation of society and culture. How can these contradictory attitudes be explained? What is the context that gives literature and literary translation such a vital function in debates on cultural orientation? Why are authors so sensitive about questions of translation and cultural exchange? In this chapter, I will attempt to analyze the conditions in which literary translation from Arabic into European languages has developed in the perspective of European-Arab relations. Special attention will be given to identity and to mutual representations of the other. On the level of theory, the points of reference will be Edward Said, 1979, and his concept of Orientalist discourse. Mikhail Bakhtin and his cultural dialogism, and the idea of the literary field conceived by Pierre Bourdieu. Translation and cultural exchange in the Nahda period. Although novelistic tendencies can be perceived in Arabic literature before the 19th century, the main achievement of Arab authors from the second half of the 19th century until the present day is the creation of a tradition of the Arabic novel. The statement implies, firstly, that the Arabic novelistic tradition is seen as a product of the Nahda period, the phase of cultural reform under the influence of increasing contacts between Europe and the Arab world. And secondly, that the Arabic novel is generally speaking derived from European models and European definitions of the genre. These observations have important consequences for the evaluation of the position of Arab writers today. They are, so to speak, born by the interaction between two cultures and by a very specific phase in the history of the Arab world characterized by European hegemony. European hegemony, efforts at reform, and the political disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabic novel was, one can say, the result of a protracted and broad social crisis and of the awareness that the world had radically changed. The period of the Nahda, and especially the relations between Europe and the Arab world in the 19th century, are often analyzed in terms of Orientalism, formulated by Edward Said. This approach holds that the Arab world was part of an imaginary Orient created by the hegemonic cultural and academic discourse in Europe and subservient to European expansionist interests. From the 18th century onwards, a systematic set of representations of this Orient was developed, which transformed the Arab world into a panorama of stereotypes and which replaced interest in the true nature of Arab societies and legitimized the European dominance in the Arab world. Moreover, Orientalist discourse provided Europe with the concept of the other, which could be utilized to formulate a specifically European identity and a Eurocentric world view. The representation of the Orient was the reflection of a self-image which became one of the mainstays of European cultural self-awareness. It has been remarked that the Nahda period from the first half of the 19th century onwards was predominantly and essentially shaped by the translation movement, consisting of more or less systematic translation of European texts into Arabic. The influence of translation in many fields gave rise to a kind of schizophrenic culture in which the intellectual elite was shaped by foreign outlooks and became estranged from the traditional ingenious corpus of knowledge. As I have shown elsewhere, at least in some cases, the European view of the Orient with the concomitant conceptions of progress and civilization were adopted and internalized by Arab intellectuals, and European forms of political and economic organization became models for reformist leaders. According to some, the importance of translated texts prevented the emergence of an authentic discourse on Arab identity, since the problem of identity was wholly seen through the prism of European conceptions. The mirror image of the other, as conceived by the Europeans, became more or less a reality, because the Orientalists themselves tried to conform to it. This view of translation in the context of cultural hegemony stresses the importance of hierarchic relations. Texts of a dominant culture were transferred to a dominated culture where they had a disproportionately large impact. Supported by the military, economic and political power of the European nations, they became the driving force of the hegemonic culture in the Arab world, dispelling the need for Europeans to revise their conceptions of the areas they ruled. Cultural exchange consisted of a one-way flow of information, knowledge, and images, imposing the Eurocentric worldview on the colonial and semi-colonial areas. Cultural exchange, therefore, became a form of cultural expansionism and an extension of imperialist schemes. So, cultural exchange, therefore, became a form of cultural expansionism and an extension of imperialist schemes. This vision of the role of translations in this history of European-Arab relations is still widespread among Arab intellectuals. The framework of the Orientalist discourse has its merits, but also has important flaws. It has been remarked by many authors that Edward Said's theoretical foundations are eclectic and not consistent. His analysis of text leaves too little room for variations and currents diverging from the mainstream. It is, in some respects, contradictory. For instance, when Said argues that Orientalism is fixed in the European subconsciousness, while at the same time it is manipulated to endorse certain political interests. It is also rather mechanistic, leaving the little opportunity for change, since Orientalism is an essential part of the European discursive structure and inseparable from the European self-image. As long as power relations remain as they are, nobody can escape Said's Orientalist propensity, not even those who criticize Orientalist discourse. In a way, the anti-Orientalist critique strengthens and ossifies the fundamental dichotomy that was, in its own view, created and reproduced by Orientalist discourse, since it is now an essential part of the European mind. A less rigid view of intercultural cultural relations can be founded on the theories of Mikhail Bakhtin, especially on his concepts of dialogism and genre, which until now have only rarely been used to analyze the cultural exchange between Europe and the Arab world. According to Bakhtin, language acquires its meaning through dialogue, and dualistic speech act in specific contexts. The production of meaning through the dialogic process is not limited to individuals, but also occurs in groups, societies, nations, and cultures by interaction and the exchange of interpretations. Images of others are formulated by a two-sided process in which the ultimate significance is a combination of interpretations of the utterances of the other. The meanings and images which determine our view of reality are subsequently organized in genres governed by certain conventions and by the continuing process of dialogue. Genres are the structurally organized components of our view of the world and also the vehicle by which this view is reproduced and transferred from one generation to the next. They contain the representations of reality and the conceptions held in common by the members of specific groups. The most complex of genres, according to Bakhtin, is the novel, since it is essentially polyphonic. That is, it allows the interference of various voices and various interpretations in a single text, in contrast to the monophonic text of myths and epics, which represent a monolithic and stagnant view of the world. The great rupture in Western culture is marked by the transition from the epic genre to the novelistic genre in the early Renaissance, when texts were no longer part of a distant mythical past but directly related to reality and daily life. In contrast to epics, novels are not self-sufficient wholes. They are so tightly related to the here and now that they are essentially open-ended, always referring to an unknown future. The novel is also tightly related to the search for identity and to an essential skepticism about the definitions of the self and fixed images of reality. In fact, it is this skepticism which inspired the transition from the epic to the novelistic genre, and which was in its turn engendered by the confrontation of the epic mind with the other, forcing it to discard its monophonic and monolithic outlook and incorporate other voices into it. Thus, the novel is intimately linked to the travelogue as an expression of individual experiences and representations of others. It is clear that Bakhtin's system of generic formation is much more open and flexible than Said's paradigm of Orientalism. It is a dynamic and less normative, and it is based on interaction. In the case of European-Arab relations, it would imply that images of the Orient are not just the monopoly of the Europeans. These images were produced rather by a cultural encounter based on observation, interpretation, and dialogic exchange, and subsequently organized within the generic system or the generic system. So, it is clear that Bakhtin's system of generic information is much more open and flexible than Said's paradigm of Orientalism. It is dynamic and less normative, and it is based on interaction. In the case of European-Arab relations, it would imply that images of the Orient are not just the monopoly of the Europeans. These images were produced rather by a cultural encounter based on observation, interpretation, and dialogic exchange, and subsequently organized within the generic system. This system continued to develop and was repeatedly adapted to include new events, observations, texts, etc. It may be argued that the idea of genre to some extent overlaps with Said's use of discourse, and perhaps it could be defended that a form of Orientalist genre arose in the age of European expansion, which reproduced the generally accepted stereotypes of the Orient. The difference would be, however, that the Bakhtinian idea of generic conventions is less static. Genres can and do dissolve into new genres. Conventions change according to circumstances, and that the dialogic context and divergent voices can be seen not as anomalies in the system, but as contributions to a dialogue which did not become predominant. Bakhtin's model can be useful for an analysis of the Nahda period in two respects. Firstly, just as the European novelistic tradition emerged from the widening of Europe's worldview in the ages of expansion, the rise of the Arabic novel can be related to the intensification of contacts between the Arab world and Europe. In the course of the 19th century, the dialogue between an expansionist Europe and the fragmenting political structures in the Middle East produced new sets of meanings, which shook the old system and of generic conventions both in Europe and in the Arab world. In Europe, several waves of exoticism followed, which repeated established images of the Orient but also added new ones. In the Middle East, it has resulted in a period of Occidentalism consisting of translations, reforms according to Western models, and reinterpretation of the traditional heritage from a new perspective, and the development of new genres. Cultural exchange was especially conducive to a debate on cultural identity, which was not merely copied from European models and concepts, but also took account of authenticity, tradition, and forms of self-assertion. An important contribution to this discussion was provided by the main realistic and imaginary travel accounts which, as in Europe some ages before, sowed the seeds of the Arabic novelistic tradition. Thus, all the constituent elements of the rise of the novelistic genre, as conceived by Bakhtin, were there, was born naturally out of a changing circumstances. Secondly, the process of translating text can be seen in a different perspective. Translations are not merely aimed at cultural appropriation, but are rather points of reference in a broader context of relations and a means to rethink and revise existing practices and ideas. The text will never be understood or interpreted according to the society that produced them, but will always be placed in the receiving society and be utilized according to its specific needs. Moreover, translations are never meant to convey a full survey of another culture, but rather to provide elements which somehow add to the images of a culture and as such provide material for self-definition. A translated text never fully assimilates into existing genres of a culture, but always contributes to the dynamism of a genre as an element functioning within the dialogic process. A text, moreover, never retains its original meaning. Its interpretation changes somewhere between its intended meaning and the models to which it is related in the receiving culture. The reception of a text is therefore never predestined, but it is rather one of the driving forces in producing representations of others and definitions of the self. One of the questions that arise from this summary of Bakhtin's concept of dialogism is how it refers to power. How do hierarchical power relations affect dialogue? Is the exchange of images and text related to political and economic power? Bakhtin himself does not go into these questions, but, especially in the discussion of European-Arab relations, they seem to be of crucial importance. Obviously, lack of balance in the power relations between two societies does not lead to a stagnation of dialogue, turning exchange into a one-sided enforcement of ideas. It would seem rather that unequal power relations do not affect dialogism as a source of meaning, but do affect the cultural goods that are exchanged. Orientalism in Europe and Occidentalism in the Arab world are two sides of the same dialogic process, although their manifestations are different. Orientalism was usually directed at the external manifestations of Arab Islamic culture and associated with various stereotypes of the Orient which had developed over time, such as mysticism, romantic barbarism, sensual sophistication, etc. The significance of important ideas, images, and text is thus related to power relations. But how are interpretation and categorizing organized? Receptions of the images produced by dialogue should be absorbed by an internal market of ideas and text in the two societies. Power relations between societies are related to power structures in these societies, which determine the trade in cultural goods and their distribution and value. Perhaps the clearest way of illustrating the functioning of cultural exchange is to imagine that each society is a participant in the culture of the other. It would appear that during the 19th century, Arab Islamic culture was present in the European cultures, especially in literature, painting, architecture, and academic research.